If I could have your attention just for a moment, or maybe a little bit longer than that, and those of you who are in line, we don't discourage you from continuing to serve yourself. First of all, good evening and welcome. I'm Mark Hamrick. I'm the 104th President of the National Press Club, just here to issue a few welcoming remarks. Tonight's program promises to be illuminating and at the very heart of what it is that we do here at the National Press Club, and that is engage in discussions about our industry. We advocate for a free press, and we certainly are engaged in training. That's the key mission of the Eric Friedheim National Journalism Library, and our amazing director, Julie Hsu, is over there coordinating that part of the work, and if you have any questions of her, please don't hesitate to ask. I just first of all just like to remind you that that is the mission of the library, and that is an organization that serves the public. It is also one that takes donations, and we have our 5K run, which helps to raise funds for the library coming up on June 11th, and that certainly is open to the public, and we urge your participation there. One of the great things that we enjoy here at the National Press Club is the ability to partner with other organizations, and we have the best of relationships with George Washington University, embodied in the fine personality of my friend Mike Friedman, who will take the microphone in just a moment. He's the executive director of the Global Media Institute there and a professor of journalism. Won't you please give him a warm round of applause? Thank you.
Thank you, Mark Hamrick, and thanks for taking time out to welcome everyone. There is a board meeting of the National Press Club, which is going to begin as soon as Mark enters the room. After his obituary was mistakenly published in a newspaper, Mark Twain, an old Associated Press man, famously sent a cable from London stating, "Reports of my death are greatly exaggerated." In this year of 2011, some have now written the obituary of newspapers. Are there publishers and editors out there today to contest the reports of their demise? Paul Steinle and Dr. Sara Brown are on a mission to find out. Since June of 2010, these two longtime media professionals have engaged in their own shoe-leather reporting by visiting newspapers across the country to take the pulse of a cross-section of dailies, weeklies, and ethnic and alternative publications. So far, they've visited 44 newspapers in 44 states. In the process, they've created a national multimedia snapshot of the status of the industry on their website, whoneedsnewspapers.org. This evening, Paul Steinle and Sara Brown will present their findings to date, as well as the trends that are beginning to emerge. Journalist and educator Paul Steinle is the former president of United Press International. He was my boss there, and a terrific one at that. He's also been a war correspondent in Vietnam for Group W Radio, a television news director at KING in Seattle, and he ran the Financial News Network. Since 1991, he has been teaching journalism at the University of Miami, Quinnipiac University in Connecticut, and Southern Oregon University, where he rose to the position of Associate Provost. Dr. Sara Brown has been involved in the newspaper business for over 30 years as a human resource professional, management trainer, columnist, and educator. She helped manage newspapers including the Los Angeles Times and has conducted leadership workshops for the American Newspaper Publishers Association, now the NAA. She was also part of that valiant effort to save United Press International. For those who wonder what their spouses think of Paul and Sara heading all over America together, you should know that they have been married to each other for over 25 years. At George Washington University, our Global Media Institute, as many of you know, explores the evolving roles and responsibilities of the media in our society, as well as the transformation of journalism in the 21st century. We could think of no better program to bring to everyone's attention than Who Needs Newspapers. And we're very pleased to once again partner with Julie Hsu and the Eric Friedheim National Journalism Library here at the National Press Club on this event. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize a couple of my colleagues in the audience. First, Barbara Porter, who is now the Chief of Staff to the President of George Washington University, Dr. Stephen Knapp. Barbara and I actually worked together at United Press International for Paul Steinle, and Barbara actually worked with Paul out in Oregon as well. And also, I'd like to recognize my colleague in the GW Global Media Institute, Heather Date, who so ably produces our Kalb Report series here at the National Press Club with Marvin Kalb. Heather stayed on tonight when she arguably should have been on the road. She is leaving early tomorrow morning for Los Angeles, where she will receive the Alliance for Women in Media's 2011 award as Outstanding Producer in a Television News Series for her fabulous work on the Kalb Report. So congratulations, Heather. And now it is my pleasure to welcome back to Washington and to the National Press Club, Paul Steinle and Sara Brown.
Thanks, Mike. So if I was really a terrific manager at UPI, well, that's another story for another time, right? So anyway, thank you. So it's fun being here. I was just thinking about the speech that Jason Robards gave for Ben Bradley in All the President's Men. All that's at stake here is the Constitution and the First Amendment, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess a lot is at stake. So we've had a lot of fun doing this project, and I want to take a moment and tell you about what the rationale was for it and where did we get this idea. Probably a little bit of it is my time at UPI, where as a broadcaster, it was a new experience to go around and visit a lot of newspapers. And I got to see how newspapers work, what the ownership was like, what the value systems were. And I was very impressed by that. And it's something that stuck in the back of my mind. I started teaching in 1991, and everybody told me that newspapers were about to die in 1991. And of course, you know, almost, well, 20 years later, they're still here. So there seems to be a flaw in the reporting of the story somewhere. And we were doing an annual First Amendment forum at Southern Oregon University. And 2 years ago, in 2009, we were looking for a topic, and I thought, well, it'd be interesting to do a topic about whether the public really understands where most of the news in the United States comes from. I mean, they go to that internet and it's all there, but where did it really come from? And as we know, the Project for Excellence in Journalism did an analysis a year or 2 or 3 ago in Baltimore, and I think it was like 60 or 70% of the news came from the newspapers. That actually seems like a low number to me, but that's what they found, so I will trust it. So we decided to do this forum, and we had to come up with a name, so I came up with a smart aleck name, Who Needs Newspapers? And the idea being a facetious one, that we don't need those at all. But of course we do, because we know that's where a lot of the information comes from. So we did that, and it was fun. We had Bob Giles come out from the Neiman Foundation and talk to our people. And we had a good turnout for it. And then I was about to retire last year, and we were looking for a project. And we sort of started talking about this, Sara and I, and sort of thinking, well, wouldn't it be fun to go around and do this? And wouldn't it be fun to have a mission? And wouldn't it be fun, the mission to be to report on the status of newspapers? And the premise is simply that how much fresh reporting have we seen from the newspapers of the United States? We know the Chicago Tribune's having problems. We know McClatchy's having problems. We've read about Lee, they're having problems. But what about the other 1,398 or 97 newspapers? So let's look into this a little bit. So we went out and decided to go out in the field and do this. To give it some framework, we created a 501c3, and we gave it the fancy name Valid Sources. The idea being, well, maybe we'll think of something else after we do this project. So let's have a little broader mantle, because that's the real issue here. We're not really concerned about, we're concerned about newspapers. We're not trying to save them. What we are concerned about is the flow of information in the United States. Where is the most reputable, credible, accurate, and ethically sort of balanced information going to come from? We think now that most of it comes from newspapers. Broadcasting, of course, contributes to that, as does radio, as does the wire services. But most of it is still coming from newspapers. So we thought it would be fun to do this. And we came up with this title, Valid Sources. We have some other people who are on our board. We created a project called Who Needs Newspapers? We didn't know all the 50 states in the United States, so we decided to go around and talk to the state associations and have them give us some advice on where to go. And that's what we've done, the State Press Association. So they've helped us a lot. So that's about the summary of the beginning of this. How is it funded? We're paying for it at the moment. We tried to get some foundation funding right away, but we couldn't. And I think it was, somebody's idea. It says, who wants to fund those people to go on a trip for a year? That doesn't sound like a good idea. Well, they should be with us, right? Because it takes us about 4 days a week to do this. times 4 times 4 times 4, 4 or 5 days. And then there's a day to drive to the next place. So we bought a truck and a fifth-wheel trailer and started in June 15th and started in Oklahoma. So that's the story. We're going to let Sara now tell us about what we've done so far.
So when you go to our website, whoneedsnewspapers.org, the first thing that comes up is this state map. And actually, if you went on there today, you would see Texas all lit up in red because that's the report that is fresh on the website. We, I guess the other thing that you will see when you click on any particular state, the yellow ones are the reports that are finished. And when you click on one of those reports, you will see generally, sometimes the lineup is a little different, but you'll see 3 video interviews. So when we go to a newspaper, we do a video interview with the publisher, the editor, and whoever is handling their online operation. Typically different title in every newspaper we've gone to. You'll also see what we call a backgrounder. So we wanted to get a lot of sort of background information. What's the size of their staff? What's their circulation? What's their revenue? We don't ask for dollars, but we ask for percentages. We ask a lot about their online operations, the kind of software they're using. So a lot of good kind of data for the newspaper. We ask them to give us 5 or 10 URLs for their best enterprise stories of the last year. So you can click on that for any given newspaper. We have some pictures and then these very rich interviews. One of the things, there were lots of things that we hoped for. One of them was we wanted people to know who ran newspapers. What's important to them? What's their value system? What kind of changes and experiments are they trying during this time of industry transition? And we ask a lot about their digital operation, their vision of their future, and how they are coping with the issues of change. So that's the sort of thing you'll see when you click on any one of these state reports. We also have, you can't see it on this visual, but we have something called J Epiphanies, Journalist Epiphanies. Paul got the idea about the time we got to Dayton, Ohio, that was our first one, to ask people who'd been journalists, so that's always the editor, sometimes it's the publisher, sometimes the online person. We asked them to tell us an anecdote about the time when the power and purpose of journalism became clear to them. So we have these wonderful little snapshot stories that many of them are very moving, and we hope at the end of the presentation to be able to share one of those with you. So our goal is 50 newspapers, 1 in every state. We flew to Alaska a year ago, April. The Alaska paper was our pilot. And we flew to Hawaii in March. But everything else has been via truck, RV, and an accompanying dog. If you, let's see, if you click on the Florida report, you will get to see Tallulah, who has been part of this trip. So, so far, we have been to 44 states. We have, I think as of today, actually 33 reports posted. It took us a while after we got started. We went, initially we drove from Ashland, Oregon, which is where we live, to Oklahoma because Paul devised this great route where we could avoid bad weather. So we started sort of in the upper Midwest. We got to New England by autumn, which was lovely. We made our way down the eastern coast. We got to Florida for Christmas, went along the deep south, and back up the west coast, and now we're doing what I think of as the mountain states, which is where we have run into the first snowfall. So let's see here. Our sample. Paul mentioned that we have used the state press associations to give us guidance on the newspapers that we might want to meet with. So typically they'll give us 2 or 3, and we've tried for a blend of circulation sizes, of ownership. We knew that we wanted to have some specials, some ethnic papers, etc. So the way it has worked out so far with the 44 newspapers is that 54% of them are under 50,000 circulation. That leaves 46% are over 50,000, and it's about 23% are over 100,000. So we've got a great mix of large and small newspapers. We have 30% of the newspapers we've been to are publicly traded. And they represent McClatchy, Cox, Lee, New York Times, Gannett, Media General, and Below. So the rest of these 70% are privately held organizations. A lot of them are groups or small groups. It would be interesting, I think, when we're all done with this and we have time to do some more analysis, to look at how privately traded organizations are faring versus publicly traded organizations. We might find something interesting there. So one more thing I wanted to tell you before I talk about consequences is what else you'll find on the website when you go to it. So far we've done about 7 what we call bonus interviews. When we've been in a part of the country where we had access to somebody who was kind of a guru with newspapers, we arranged to have interviews with them. So we actually met today with Tom Rosensteel. We've met with Ken Doctor. We've met with Philip Meyer. These are people who have sort of studied the industry, but we have met with Al Cross from the rural journalists. We've met with people from NAA, from Pointer. So those interviews, I think, give some useful context and perspectives on what's happening in the industry. So what role do newspapers play in our society? So when I start these interviews, Paul's a cameraman, I do the interviews, and we ask initially for them to tell us what they think their key contributions are to their communities. At the end of the interview, we ask them to say or to guess what might the impact be on their communities if their newspaper were to close its doors and not be replaced by a similar news organization. And these are some of the responses to that question.
Intellectual power outage. I think just the lights would go out. Democracy doesn't do well in a dark place. Democracy does well with the bright light of scrutiny shine directly on it. And if the day wasn't here, then that light would be extinguished.
We have the luxury in newspapers still of applying a fairly rigorous ethical and intellectual standard to what we do. That other organizations could be able, might be able to do, but for the most part they're not doing it as rigorously as we are. So that's what would disappear. A large part of the universe of news and information that is gathered, created and or gathered by professional reporters who observe a standard of behavior, of ethics, of intellectual approach to their work would disappear.
Would disappear.
I think that, and by the way, I don't think it's, I don't mean this specifically to Morgantown or Monongalia County, West Virginia. I mean this anywhere USA. If you don't have a responsible news organization to ensure that your rights are being protected, to ensure the governor is not taking your money and going to buy a car for their wife or their son, to ensure that government is doing what it's supposed to be doing, the people that you're paying, I think that would have a devastating effect on this nation as a whole, not just this little community.
So the problems I think you've heard already, but I'll just reiterate them quickly. Declining advertising, not surprisingly, and circulation. You know, and the competition from digital news that's out there. And then, of course, the perception that newspapers are dying, which we keep hearing over and over and over again. And I think that's one of the issues that we're going to talk about here tonight. Is that the correct perception? Newspapers are dying. But we'll talk about it later. We talked to one publisher, and one of the interesting things about this trip was it occurred right at the end of the really killer part of the recession for newspapers. 2007, 8, and 9, and you know, that was really the bottom. And they were starting to come out of it again. So here's Gary Ferrugia. He's the publisher of the Day in New London.
Dealing with two recognizable challenges here. There is a tsunami going through our industry and all of society. And so the technological changes have prodded us to rethink our business plan. And then coupled with that has been this oppressive recession that has hammered 7 billion people in the world, but has hit particularly hard businesses that rely on advertising as a major source of revenue. The economic recession has caused us to reduce expenses, to try to consolidate areas. The structural changes that are happening and driven by technology have caused us to really rethink how we do what we do and how we take the respected and valued traditions of a newspaper and transform that into an emerging digital
business. So, as we said before, these PowerPoints either work or they don't, and God knows why. So here's the big question, I think, and I think it's a question of framing. You know, we hear about that all the time. Is the frame newspapers are dying? Is that the frame? He just used the word transformation. You know, and I think that's a much better word because based on what we've seen, there's an awful lot of activity going on. Nobody's sitting around and they haven't just read the diagnosis and decided to go into hospice. This is not the situation. You know, what we discovered was people were fighting and they're coming up with new ideas and they're reorganizing. They're putting resources in different places. We went to the Boston Globe, and what the Globe is doing, they did a lot of things to change. They were up for sale, I guess, a year and a half ago. And they made some structural changes. They consolidated their printing. They did things like that. They changed their printing schedule so that they could be more efficient. And as they look forward, what they're trying to do is come up with a metered approach. They're going to take, in Boston, there's boston.com. That's the Boston Globe right now. They're thinking of creating bostonglobe.com and having that sold on a metered basis the same way the New York Times is. They haven't started it yet, but it's something they're working on. And here's the way Chris Mayer, who is the publisher, sort of summarized this.
Well, if you look at the volume that we're doing right now through Boston.com, if you look at the amount of mobile traffic that we have and what that and how that continues to escalate. We have never had more consumers of our content. We have over 50% penetration in this marketplace between print and digital. So it really is a question of managing through the transition of consumer habits, some of which will always, or for a long time, be in print, but are also at some level becoming more and more digital as technology makes those solutions much more compelling or much more mainstream. So we're really focused on managing through the transition, but recognizing the success that we've had in terms of attracting that readership, both print and digital, has been
tremendous. We just tested it and it worked. Of course, now it isn't.
When we started our trip and our project, we had developed a list of interview questions, and the questions for this backgrounder that I told you about. And we decided to get some feedback from Eric Newton, who's at the Knight Foundation, and he kind of slapped us around a bit and said, well, these are perfectly good questions maybe for 10 years ago, but you don't have the meat you need to have for the digital operation. So we really beefed up our questions. We started really focusing on what were these organizations doing in terms of their websites and their digital products. Because most of these newspapers have had websites for 10 or 15 years. And one of the things that they've learned is it's very difficult for newspapers to make money from their digital operations, from their websites. The revenue just isn't there. Digital advertising brings in about 1/10 of the revenue that print advertising has historically. So we began to understand how absolutely critical it was for us to be talking more about what was the newspaper doing in terms of its website and its digital plans and its advertising plans. And so we'll hear first from Debbie Mead, who is the publisher in Roanoke. Question: can digital revenues finance a quality news organization similar to what you have today?
So I can see a time when, again, if devices continue to improve the way we've seen them improve only over the past few years, and more people want to consume their news and information that way, then I think then a model will have to be found to continue to have quality in that way. This is a real challenge that's facing our entire business, though, as you know. Everybody would love to figure that out. It's like the holy grail of how you can do it. The problem is in the internet world, free tends to be the way the internet has developed, the expectation from consumers that it is free or very cheap. And that just doesn't help support a model where, again, like in a town like Roanoke, where you have nearly 100 journalists out covering the news, journalists of quality.
So in the industry, there's this issue now. How will newspapers begin to get some revenue from these websites? And there are various points of view. There is the paywall versus no paywall controversy, or something in the middle. People on the no paywall side believe that if they have an enticing, engaging website, they will get a lot of eyeballs, and that will attract advertisers, and they will make money from advertising. On the paywall side is our product has value and we should receive something for it. And in the middle, there are various things, subscription models where you subscribe to the product, but you get all the print and all the digital platforms. So one of the first operations to have a paywall is Walter Hussman from the Arkansas Democrat Gazette. And he's been kind of a model in the industry for paywalls.
One of the most significant changes we've made is a change that didn't happen in the last 2 or 3 years, but happened 9 years ago. And the fact that we haven't changed, I think, is really significant. And that is, in 2001, we decided to stop giving our content away free on our website. We have maintained that policy now for the last 9 years. And we think that's probably the most significant policy decision we have made that has had an impact on the success of our decision to publish a newspaper. If you look at our circulation, we did a comparison of 1998 to 2008. And I used 2008 because that's the first time we did this comparison. Also, that was before many newspapers had to start aggressively raising their circulation rates once we got into the recession. But in that 10-year period, we lost no circulation daily or Sunday, while many newspapers around the country were losing 15, 20, 25, 30% of their circulation. And so I think that's the most significant policy decision we've made.
So as we went around the country and we talked to these newspapers and we talked to them about their various business models, everybody was scratching their heads and looking for, really looking around to see what everybody else was going to do. And I think there's been a lot of interest in seeing how the New York Times' new metered model will fare. For those of you who might not be familiar with that metered model, you get 20 free clicks a month on their website, and after that you are then asked to pay. So the industry is watching that. So they're all kind of looking for what will work. And we went to St. Pete Times and talked with Joe DeLuca, who I think gave us a very interesting perspective.
There isn't going to be one answer. There is no silver bullet. There will be many, many different revenue streams like that, but the basic part of our business, the basic business model still remains the same. We create content, we find an audience for that content, and we deliver that audience to an advertiser, and they do some kind of business and commerce with them. And I think that stays the same, but the way we get paid for that is going to change, and there may be 15 or 20 or 25 different types of revenue streams coming together around the digital piece.
If I could. Okay. Newspapers are known as being somewhat risk-averse, of being sort of legacy organizations for many years. They didn't really have to change. They were the only game in town. And one of the areas that we found were problematic to newspapers was the advertising sales staff. So they might have been very comfortable selling print advertising, long-term relationships with advertisers. And so we began to ask a lot about how are you transitioning your print ad reps to selling digital. And a number of them are now beginning to have sort of specialists in their advertising department helping those ad reps who were comfortable in what they were doing, making that transition.
Change. And understanding how to communicate the concepts to the various generations of advertisers and sales reps. We have people that have worked with this newspaper for 30 years. They believe in print. They've been selling print. That print's been working. I don't understand this new online thing. So it's planting seeds that will slowly open their mind to receive this new information, so that they, again, because sales is all about relationships. So the person that's been here 30 years has built some very strong relationships with their client, with their customer base, and they believe them and they trust them. So what better person to communicate this new change to this advertiser than this person who they've had a relationship with for the last 20, 30 years. So our goal, or my role, is to communicate with clarity, or as best I can communicate with clarity, new concepts, new ideas, new developments, so that this person then again can transfer that information to the client via the relationship that they have. From the advertiser standpoint, you have people, again, local advertisers or local businesses, local companies who are very much like this newspaper, generations of owners that have gone through the family. Well, my dad did this, and my granddad did this, and my great-granddad did this, that sort of thing. So you have to come in and say, I understand. But your great-granddaddy rode a horse and buggy. What are you driving? There's some things, it's very much the same. So utilizing analogies, other analogies of change and transition, and talking about media consumption and how we use, how we receive and get our news and information, and then just communicating that to them, again, with clarity as best we can, is what we try to do, is what my role is.
So change is one of the big problems. And in the newsroom, of course, it's the same thing. So we've heard this over and over again. The cultures need to change from once a day to 24/7. And I guess some people feel, well, they can't do that. They've been doing everything the same way too long, and they're incapable of change. But here's a fellow who's been doing this for 40 years, and here's what he has to say about it.
This a long time, have changed many times over, and we will have to adapt to survive. I'm a real believer that the basic tenets of good journalism will survive. There are a lot of people that seem to think newspapers are dead. Well, I think journalists are not dead. Newspapers are going to survive for a while, but people are going to want information, and they're going to want credible information. And it isn't some blogger out there who's blogging away with his opinion as though it were a stated fact that's going to be accepted. It's going to be the journalist that provides credible information. But the journalist is going to have to adapt as to the form of delivery. I think something like the iPad that just came out not long ago, I think we're going to see a lot of newspapers showing up on iPad. But there may be other forms of presentation on the iPod that still provides credible information from people who are trained to provide the facts. So yeah, I think we're going to have to adapt.
So I think adaptation is something that's happening everywhere. The other thing we learned quickly was that the model of a new journalist is the Swiss Army knife. And here it is articulated by the digital director at the Concord Monitor in Concord, New Hampshire.
I think that a journalist coming into my position or any position these days needs to be a bit of a Swiss Army knife, which is difficult. And I think you'll see that in a lot of the journalism programs around. On the side, I teach journalism, and it's really interesting. One of the first things that I tell my students is, if you're in this to not do math, I'm sorry. Like or you're in this because you don't like technology. It's just not possible anymore. You need to know a little bit of everything.
So I think the other thing we learned was that, and this seems to be a common thought too across the industry, that the news must now be delivered however people want it. The idea of the newspaper as the only delivery method, is just not going to work anymore.
I think what it comes down to for all newspapers is really the same thing. I mean, are you going to be bringing information and the stories of your community to that community? And if you're going to be doing that, are you doing it in the way that people want? We live in a society where people want what they want, when they want it, how they want it. And we have to be able to do that. And I think the word newspaper and exactly what that means to people will change. But in the end, we need to be the leading news and information organizations for our community, be advocates for our community, demonstrate that we care about our community and our readers. And I think that they will come along with us in their own way, whatever device or delivery method that they choose. And if we don't convince them of those things, then they'll be off somewhere else.
They'll be off somewhere else. This seems to be perfectly obvious, but again, I think it's something that we thought about a lot. The newspapers have adopted this web-first publishing tactic to remain competitive. It's really important, obviously, in a metro area when you have multiple news organizations. In Houma, Louisiana, it's not such a big deal. There's not a lot of people fighting you for the headlines. But if you're anywhere else where there's any kind of flow coming in from different organizations, you almost have to adapt a web-first policy. The other thing I get a kick out of is this one. The people in the newspaper industry have just discovered that video is harder than they thought it was going to be. Those of us in broadcasting, of course, sort of knew this, but to them it was like, we'll get that flip camera, we'll just go out and take those pictures. Well, it isn't quite that easy. So this is just a little subtle nuance of something we discovered, and I get a kick out of it. Probably that's why it's in this list. And here's this new attribute for newspapers, interactivity. Pretty exciting. It's fun to see who's reading your stories. You can have conversations with the readers. You can do crowd sourcing. You can talk to them. But there's only one problem with this. There's also these comment areas in the newspaper. And this is something every editor in America must have nightmares about. And here's a fellow articulating it from Houma.
It's some of the best and the worst of what of what we can offer on our website. I think it's kind of obvious in common sense that if you can give people a free forum, they may be more willing than otherwise they would be to express themselves, and that is really the mission or the purpose behind the anonymous forums that we have, is to give people who may otherwise feel, for one reason or another, that they aren't interested or willing to express an opinion, whether it be controversial or not. They'll do it if they have that opportunity to do it without revealing who they are. On the other hand, it's got the sort of seedier side where people will say things that are cruel or bigoted or just dumb.
So all along the way, people who we talk to about the report, friends or whatnot, say, well, what have you learned? What did you know that you sort of didn't know already? And for a long time, that was rather a hard question for us to respond to. But in preparing for our presentation tonight, it occurred to me that this is sort of like a question that I read somewhere that Ralph Waldo Emerson would pose to his colleagues when they met for coffee at Starbucks or wherever they met in those days. And he would say to them, "What has become clear to you since we last met?" So I think this process of, one newspaper a week for a year has been a process of gaining sort of visceral clarity about what's going on in this country with these newspapers, and sort of almost like sort of absorbing it. And so we have identified some sort of first findings, and then it is our hope that when we get off the road and post the last report, which will be probably the first week of October, we'll have time then to sit and say, okay, what do we really know? But this is what we know at the moment. No one told us that they believed that print was dead. No one told us that they believed that it was dying. Now, there are lots of speculations about the future of print. And last week, we were in Salt Lake City, and we went to the Deseret News. And the president and CEO of the Deseret News, Clark Gilbert, is probably one of the most, well, what would we call him?
Rabid.
Rabid, okay. Rabid
Advocate.
proponents of digital news that we've come across. And so we were curious to see what he thought. And so here we have Clark Gilbert.
And will newspapers go away? I think print has some compelling features to it that will make it last for a little season. And only if they learn to define and differentiate themselves. If you want to be a generic news organization covering all topics on all things, that model in print's not going to last very long. And if you can find a differentiated position, I think you can find a position in the market that will last, you know, I won't say 20 years, but will last for a while. We're planning on growing our print circulation over the next 2 years quite dramatically. But it's because we feel like we've defined the product very carefully in a way that makes it
unique.
One of our bonus interviews was Ken Doctor. Ken Doctor wrote a book called Newsonomics, quite a good book that we recommend to people. But one of the things he said to us was that the life is being sucked out of newsrooms. Now, newsrooms and newspapers have gone through a lot of staff reductions. But when he said that, I thought, you know, that isn't what we heard. Now, we have to kind of go back to who have we been talking to. We've been talking to 44 newspapers recommended by their state press associations as being General Excellence Award winners or doing things that were innovative. So it's very possible that there are a lot of newsrooms who are lacking in energy, but that isn't what we found at the newspapers where we were.
I think the most successful changes that we've made have been the change in culture in the newsroom environment. And by that I mean I think everybody in our newsroom, after everything they've gone through in the last couple of years, they really get it. I mean, they know that if we want to continue to put out a newspaper every day, if we want to continue to provide Jackson with the news that it needs, they have to evolve. And they have to be more nimble, they have to be more flexible. And I think the successful part of that is that everybody is re-energized. You know, we have veteran reporters who, you know, they can recall the days where they were, you know, back on the deadline and they loved it, and now they're back on deadline again. It's crucial. They're energized by it, and they're embracing the new mediums. You know, our reporters are doing a lot with video now. They're doing a lot with uploading their own stories. They're, you know, they kind of have to be able to do it all. And that's, in a lot of ways, that's exciting. It's been exciting for me as somebody who's been in the industry for 16 years. The first 10 of it, which was pretty stagnant, now I'm learning all of this new stuff, and it's been
exciting.
We've talked about the need for multiple skills. I like that Swiss Army knife metaphor. It's been interesting talking to the editors about, we ask them, one of our questions is, how should prospective journalists prepare? What are their prospects and how should they prepare? And many of them say they have to be good writers. They have to be curious, they have to have good critical thinking skills, they have to get out there and dig for the story and we'll teach them the digital part. But there are a lot of other editors who say, well, they have to be good writers. They have to have those basic journalistic skills. But it sure helps if they are comfortable with the web, if they know how to do video, if they have these skills, it's just a little icing on the cake. But it's clear that they have to be multitaskers, they have to work hard. That's with reduced staffs, people have to work hard. Keys to success. We found that these newspapers, large and small, said what distinguishes us or can distinguish us is that we can cover our local community better than anybody else. Now there's more and more competition. There's the patch, there's the aggregators, but they still believe that they have more people in their newsrooms to cover their local community than their competitors, and they are a trusted brand, and they can do that. So local emphasis is key. They also believe that the watchdog reporting that they do, and this also comes from history, context. It's sometimes difficult because watchdog reporting, investigative reporting, takes time and staff and resources, money. And so there's a lot of kind of juggling to do the kind of watchdog reporting that they want to do. They also see themselves to be the center of the community dialogue. We heard numerous times them describe themselves as the glue that holds the community together. They're like the town square. They are the sort of community meeting place within, through the newspaper. And a number of them are really good citizens. They give a lot of money back to their communities. They support nonprofits. They have fundraisers. They do a lot for charity. So this being engaged with their communities seems to be a key for the ones that appear to be successful. And next is prioritizing. I think it was first in Burlington, Vermont, that we heard the phrase that the newspaper of record is no longer possible. That because of smaller staffs, they have to prioritize their coverage. They have to identify what their readers, what their audience wants, what they do best, and focus their resources on that. Clark Gilbert, who you heard just a little bit earlier, the Deseret News, Deseret Digital, is owned by the Mormon Church. So they have a perspective, and what they have done, I think it's interesting in terms of prioritization. They have 6 areas of coverage that they've identified. They are in harmony with the teachings of the church, and that's where they put their primary experienced reporters on those areas of coverage. And for the rest of their coverage, they have what they call Deseret Connect, which is a stable of about 500 community journalists. Now these in some cases are people with specific expertise, so if they want to do a story on a particular topic, they might tap these people for that purpose, but they're also just people who are covering neighborhoods. There are pros and cons with that, and can't remember if we cover those pros and cons. We can certainly talk about them. There are pros and cons of journalistic professional standards. Most of the newspapers are trying to do, the buzzword is hyperlocal coverage, and that's easier to do with digital, because you can you have unlimited space, so you can give a lot of space to what's going on in neighborhoods, and that's part of that whole. We cover the local news. That's very important to people. It's still important to people, you know, to cover sports in these towns, sports in print, refrigerator clippings, etc. So prioritized, focused coverage is very important. And the other sort of important finding is this issue of circulation. In some cases, part of their cost-saving strategy at the papers, and actually we heard it quite a bit, was that the papers intentionally reduced their circulation footprint, they would call it. So they would stop delivering to areas that were just too costly for them to deliver to. They might have stopped giving print copies to their newspaper and education programs. Instead, they would make those newspapers or digital renditions on the web. It's a, I guess I don't know what more to say about circulation. It is a troublesome area.
Yeah, and one of the ironies of all this too is that I mentioned before is that the reach has been extended. So here you are, you're running this newspaper, you're now reaching more people than you ever have before with your news. So how do you feel about it? Is it really going to work for you? Here's the publisher of the St. Petersburg Times, and you can see the dilemma in his face and the way he talks about this.
It's a little hard to tell what form it'll take. I mean, we can also, I think, safely predict that it will become ever more important, that more and more people will be able to we'll be able to reach more and more people at more and more places through our digital offerings. About 3 months ago, I got an iPad. I find that potentially very important in the delivery of news and information and advertising. But it's just not clear what form that change will take. It's clear that there will be such a change, but it's not clear to me what form it's going to take. I mean, particularly when you think about how, at least for the moment, how comparatively little revenue, advertising revenue there is in electronic offerings versus print offerings. I don't think we can begin to see yet what form the new way will ultimately is going to take. I think we have to be trying lots of things and seeing what seems to work and what doesn't seem to work.
And what doesn't seem to work. So 2 more things, and this is a really interesting one, digital management. You know, we went to 44 newspapers, and I think we had 44 job titles for this particular job. I mean, nobody has decided exactly what it is. Is it the web editor? Meg Heckman, who you saw there, was the community outreach editor, and she was in charge of the digital. We've had audience managers, and I think that's what shows the dynamism of this. I mean, and how uncertain it is. There's a lot of uncertainty here, but there's a lot of energy going into it too. People are trying all these things and experimenting. So this is kind of the final thought I'd like to leave you with, and that is that I think the framing of this is what needs to be changed. I wish I could come up with a short way of saying this, but I haven't figured out one yet, if there is one. You know, I think I see newspapers as a single platform, 3-dimensional medium. Print, graphics, pictures. That's a stretch on 3 dimensions, of course, but that's what they have been for a long time and still are, basically. But what they've done is add all these digital attributes, and they have become multi-platform, multimedia news and information companies. They're not just media companies, they're news and information companies, which is very specific. They're not doing movies or billboards. They're in the news business, and they're doing it through all these different ways. So this is what I think is the clearest way of saying what's happening, and that is that this transformation is taking place, and you know, the outcome is unclear, but it looks to me like newspapers are going to be around for the foreseeable future and probably a part of this multimedia platform and set of products that are being delivered. So that's what we've got to say to you. And if you have any questions, we'd love to answer. Yes, sir.
Can I leave that first?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm Drew Davis. I'm president of the American Press Institute.
Oh, great. Okay.
We actually hired Clark Gilbert when he was just a Harvard professor.
Exactly.
To work on our Newspaper Next project 3 years ago. This was the best, most concise statement for those of you who are looking for a basket to put what the state of the newspaper industry is. The best, most concise statement of the state of newspapers today. One thing you didn't mention was that this is still a $35 billion a year industry. Now, it's not the $70 billion a year industry that it was in 2006. Craigslist sucked $10 billion of classified advertising revenue right out, most of it never to come back. And that was the bulk of the profit margins of the industry. The industry is still throwing off 5 to 10% operating income margins, which is more than grocery stores, it's more than banks. It's still a profitable industry. And the companies like Tribune and others that got into trouble in the last few years got into trouble because they took on huge crushing debt. This industry still employs 40,000 journalists. That's more than anybody else. No other medium comes remotely close. And just with a apology to broadcast, most broadcast news outlets start their day reading the print newspaper to figure out where they're going to send their cameras, unless there's a tornado or cataclysmic event that's telegenic. Rush Limbaugh doesn't have a daily radio program without first reading the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, even though he disdains them. Jon Stewart doesn't have a daily show on television without first reading the newspapers. Now, the challenge is that you stated very clearly is that all of digital advertising for newspapers now is about $3.5 billion, which doesn't equal the $4 billion being expended for salaries for reporters and editors. That's a challenge. But remember I said total revenues are $35 billion. Much of that $35 billion goes into the cost of manufacturing and delivering newspapers. I'm almost done. How many of you have a Kindle? Anybody? Your Kindle costs how much? $120, $130? It costs the Washington Post $285 to manufacture and deliver one Washington Post to one customer for a year. They could give each of their $500,000 customers a Kindle or some tablet reader and never have to kill another tree or pay a teamster to drive a truck. So the economics are shifting, and I think that the digital future that you so well described is an opportunity to get out from under the infrastructure of $100 million hunks of iron presses and newsprint, which today costs $600 a metric short ton, which is a lot of money. So well done.
Was there a question?
In music, they call that a coda.
I see. Good.
Yeah. I noticed in a couple of reports, and I think I looked today at the main newspaper, I forget what the name of the paper was, but it talked about when you have this multimedia performance by reporters, they're posting video to the web, they're sending out tweets and covering a court session live. How do the papers maintain editorial control when reporters are publishing direct to the consumer, and you've cut out the copy desk editor and the rim editor and other eyes that ordinarily would have looked at copy before it went to the consumer?
Well, we didn't study that in depth, but we talked about it, and it's an issue that they're all concerned about. You know, there was much more oversight than I thought there was, frankly. Most places have somebody look at everything. They're not looking at the tweets, you're right. So, I mean, if you're at the court and you say somebody was innocent and they were guilty, and it goes out, I mean, there's nobody checking that. But maybe that's the last thing you ever do for that newspaper or whatever. At some point, I think you have to sort of back away and say, who are the people that are going to be doing this? Well, the people who are doing it are the same ones who have seen the SBJ code, the same ones who work with their editors all the time. So they're not, somebody who's never done this before. So they, common sense at some point is going to control them. But is there a chance of things happening? Absolutely. But we really didn't see very much of that. It was mostly in the tweets. That was the one. And
Facebook.
Yes, but not as much. I mean, because the tweet is sort of the fast, this is what just happened thing. There are individuals doing certain things, and there's less control than there used to be. But interestingly, for example, there is a Facebook editor at the Austin American-Statesman, a social media editor who works at that and works with it. And a couple of places said they did everything through the editing desk. So it's still, it's an issue people are sensitive to, and they're still learning how to do it. So I don't think in the short term it's going to destroy the credibility of this. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
How do blogs figure into the reporting mechanism?
In a number of the newspapers, actually, reporters had blogs. I mean, the reporters themselves were blogging, and in some cases it was through their blogs that the interactivity would occur. So that would mean that a reporter would sort of monitor those comments. We had the fellow from HOMA who talked about the difficulty of sort of monitoring inappropriate responses. Are you talking about bloggers who might be like community journalists? Is that?
Well, I'm just asking what trends emerged with regard to the use of blogs.
I think it's too broad a topic to get your hands around. Certain papers do it. They have designated people who do it, though. And what is a blog? It's a journal, basically. And if you got the guy who covers the Washington Nationals doing a blog about the Washington Nationals, he knows a lot about that, or she knows about that. And it just comes out in this form, which is very informal, and it's called a blog. On the other end of the spectrum, we've got people who anybody who owns a computer who wants to put up a website can have their blog. So, I mean, so how do you compare these two things? The expert over here and the novice over here. So I think Sarah brings out a good point. In a number of places, they use the blogs as a place where the reporter can have a dialogue with the community. So there's a comments part of it. So that's pretty interesting. And I think, again, we more or less saw people were watching these, people being the editors. They're watching what's out there. Is it a place for growth? I think it is, because it's a different kind of journalism. I mean, the New York Times used to have the Reporter's Journal. I remember reading those. This is the same thing. I mean, a blog, it's called a blog, but that's what it is. I went there and this is what I thought. I wrote my story, but I saw these other things happening, and isn't it interesting? So I think it all fits together. But the whole concept of blogs is one of those things that's like, it's too broad and diffuse to get your hands around it and say, blogs are going to do this or bloggers are going to do that. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you said that 30% of the pitch you listed were publicly owned and 70% privately owned. Did you perceive any difference in how they look upon the future based on the way they are owned?
Well, it was actually, as I was putting this data together, that I thought, I mean, we didn't set out to do anything but to sort of generally say we want kind of a cross section of public and private, but we weren't closely monitoring it. And it was sort of after the fact that I thought, well, isn't it interesting that we ended up with such a preponderance of privately held companies? I mean, I don't know exactly what it means, but it must mean that somehow these privately held companies were doing something that got them to be designated as general excellence winners or being innovative. So as I said, I think it's grounds for a good study to see what it is that these privately held companies are doing. I mean, some of these privately held companies they're big. I mean, there are a number of small ones, but some of them are quite big, but they're not publicly traded companies, and they don't have that kind of pressure or perhaps debt in some cases, and they may be able to do more.
I don't think we could generalize about them, but I think, it's quite obvious that the locus of control is closer at the private company. You're closer to the owner, and the owners are part of the community usually. And of course that makes a difference. They go to the Rotary Club, or whatever. The Seroptimists, I guess, is their female, right? And they feel more pressures, and they're going to put more into their newspaper probably. That's not saying that the public ones aren't good, have their virtues as well, because they often bring more expertise. Cox, for example, has a concentration of digital people working on this. So it's instead of 3 or 4 people sitting at a newspaper, it's 20 or 30 sitting in Atlanta working on it. Same thing with the Media General, et cetera. So, there are trade-offs in all these things. I don't think we could generalize, though, about one finding one way or the other.
But I think it's an interesting thing to pursue.
There's a young woman back there. Yeah.
I come from a public relations background, and I'm interested in what you've been saying, and particularly the decline of media relations, because I just started a company where I help nonprofit organizations match their interests with the right reporter. And I've heard a lot of backlash on that idea, because people say newspapers are dead, why are you doing that? And to hear your facts is great for me, but I wonder how we change the perception that newspapers are dying so that people realize that that's not actually the case.
Well, that's a great thing. I wish I could figure out how to do that too. I'll tell you a UPI story. So when I was the president of UPI, we had a meeting with Donald Graham at one point, who you know who that is. And this was in '89 or something. And he said to me, and I'm paraphrasing, he said, well, I don't really think about UPI anymore. I was thinking, oh, we're dead in the water because of the perception. There had been so many stories about the death of UPI that here was a person who was a leader in this field, and he just had taken UPI and sort of set it aside. And I think that's what's happening, because there have been so many stories about the death of newspapers where people are saying, well, that's a dead issue, let's not be involved anymore. But it's not the reality, I think, that we just heard here. It's still a major force out there, and it will be for a long time.
110 million people
right.
read a newspaper every day. That's more people than watch the Super Bowl.
So I think the way to deal with it is facts. If somebody says that to you, you say to them, here's what's out there. What do you think? Is this worthless? As I said before, I heard in 1991 when I started teaching, the newspapers were about to die. And it's a much more complicated issue than that.
I mean, we've had publishers say to us that they would have advertisers say, gee, it's too bad that your newspaper is dying. And they'd say, well, it isn't, we're here. And I think it's a real dilemma, frankly, how to you made your case so well. How about
reporters in newspapers who put a lot of ink into how crummy newspapers were for the last 3 years.
Oh, more than that.
And somebody said, I read somebody said, newspaper reporters would gleefully report the end of the world. Now, I can say I was a reporter for 20 years.
When is it, by the way? Never mind. Sir.
Yeah, it seems to me in 2 cities, Seattle and Denver, when newspapers closed, some of the journalists for those papers started, what do they call them, online newspapers?
Mm-hmm.
But is that very widespread now? That's the only couple I remember.
Well, the one in Seattle, you know, I'll tell you another inside story that we tried to do a story about that newspaper and they didn't want to talk to us. So for whatever reason, I don't know, we talked to the other one, and which is the Seattle Times. That's the one that's still publishing. But they've really integrated themselves into the digital world because Seattle, not surprisingly, has a lot of startups, and they had a lot of community news going on. So they sort of reached out to them, and they built a cooperative with them. So they have a number of neighborhood reports that are now attached to the Times, the Seattle Times. The PI, meanwhile, is doing what it's doing. Unfortunately, we don't know what it is, and I'd love to report it to you, but they won't tell us. And maybe you would know, but you know, but there are experiments, and there's some interesting ones. Ann Arbor's an interesting one. I think Newhouse owns that newspaper in Ann Arbor, and what they did there was they shut down the paper, the printed paper, and then they created a new paper, an online paper, and then now they still have a printed paper 3 days a week. So they're playing the best of both worlds. And I think that's an interesting formula. You know, I think that's kind of a forerunner of what could happen, where in communities where there really is no news of consequence on Monday and Tuesday, for example, and no reason to be advertising then, you might see 4 or 5 day a week newspapers. So there'll be experiments like this, and we're going to see these all around the country. The question is, well, as soon as that happens, well, people say, well, that's the death of newspapers. You know, they're about to die again because we've just seen in Ann Arbor where they closed it, and that's the stories that are written. But, you know, and there's a change going on. There's a transformation going on. The question is, what is it? And let's see if we can identify it and just report on that rather than predicting the end. Let's predict what's happening, or let's report what's happening, excuse me.
Yes.
Yes.
I was wondering, you know, it seems pretty clear that the younger generation doesn't read newspapers except for those of us who might be in journalism itself, but I know plenty of kids, they don't read newspapers. They get their news online. Did you ask that question of the newspaper publishers and how they would handle that?
Well, I think, you know, this generational shift, they all understand that that's happening. And so there's kind of a time frame here of making their digital operations more and more robust, trying to find revenue streams so that they can replace the former print advertising with digital advertising. They have to make money to fund their newsrooms. I mean, this is just what it gets down to. So I think there's this sense of there's some time. You know, there's still a lot of us who really enjoy our print newspapers. Actually, I've had a lot of people tell me on college campuses, you will see students walking around with their newspaper, with their college print newspaper. I would like to think that means something for newspaper readers, but I think there is that realization. They all realize that, you know, that generationally there's going to be that shift, and they've got to figure this out.
As we know, the newspaper reading is a different experience. Online is one experience. Reading a newspaper is a different experience. You have the serendipity factor when you read a newspaper. You're going to see these stories which you never would have in a million years think to look for. Or you're at lunch and you want to have this thing with you, or you're wherever you are and it's the end of the day and you want to spend time doing it. I think the real issue is time. You know, I think as the economy gets squeezed and squeezed, people just don't have time to do it. And that's a bigger problem. And, you know, we don't know the answer to these questions, but the newspapers realize it's a problem.
Yes.
Is journalism good business? Why or why not?
Is journalism good business? Well, the newspapers that we went to are reporting profit margins of roughly averaging 10 to 15%. We met with Tom Rosenstiel today, who recently published the sort of state of media and the state of newspapers, and he said they were averaging 5%. We know that there are a lot of investment bankers and private equity firms who are more and more in control of newspapers. I guess they think there might be some revenue opportunities there.
Yeah, but that's really not the
Are they good business? Are they good businesses?
Journalism, good business.
Yes, it is, because journalists are information consultants. That's what we are. You know, you hire a consultant, you want to build a house, you have an architect or a builder come and they tell you how to do it. You don't do it yourself because you probably don't know how to do that. The same thing is true with information. How much time do you have to figure out what's going on in Congress? I mean, you could go up there and go to every session. You could watch C-SPAN all the time. You could take notes. Maybe you could figure it out. But, you know, with all the sources we have here, it's much easier. And we need that in our lives if we're going to make informed decisions. If you want to, I mean, if you don't want to make informed decisions, of course, then I guess it's not a good investment. But I think there are probably enough people in this country that want to do that. We hope so, anyway.
There's a really good book that answers that question. It's called The Value of News by a guy named Robert McConnell, S-C-A-R-D. He says that news is like knowledge, and there's two types of knowledge. There's intrinsic knowledge that makes you the smartest person at the cocktail party, and you can get that in newspapers. But then there's also knowledge that is essential for you to do your business, to be able to function as a member of a community, to make wise decisions in your participation in representative democracy. And it's that type of knowledge, news, that has value that can and should be charged for. It's exclusive and it's unique.
Did that answer your question?
Well, what I see, and this is an observation, not a question, is what you're describing is obviously a fact. I mean, we're a knowledge economy, okay? And that any given person's value to his or her employer is based on his skill as a knowledge worker, okay? But is that in and of itself a business model, okay? How do you translate that into a business? You know, what they're describing in the newspaper business is you're attracting an audience to a certain set of, you know, news articles so that advertisers attach themselves to it.
This sounds like a conversation you should have between the two of you.
Right, right.
Let's do one more question and then we'll wrap this up because some people have to go. Thank you. Joe.
Paul, do you have a sense that as the big city dailies have been passing, say the Chicago Daily News, the Houston Post, and that's where we get much of the blaring headlines about newspapers dying. But I get the sense from the reports that you've been doing around the country that smaller dailies and regional newspapers and weeklies are doing proportionally much better than they may have been even 30 years ago. Perhaps because there's the vacuum created by the passing of some of these major newspapers. Do you share that perception?
Well, I don't think it's a vacuum. I think they just have value and they continue to have value.
But have they increased in inverse proportion, perhaps, to the passing of the big?
Well, I don't know about that. I just think that they've always been a part of their communities and they're going to be for the foreseeable future. Let me share one more thing with you here before we leave. This is something from our website, and we'll wrap things up with this. We talked about the journalism epiphanies that we have, and we asked people about what the power and purpose of journalism became clear to them. And we did the Afro-American in Baltimore, and we talked to Jake Oliver, who is the publisher. And here was the experience he shared with us about this.
When I was a kid, my father, who was president of this paper, with his cousin, who was the chairman, and his other cousins who were all around him, when he retired as president, he had an old world perspective of what this paper was supposed to be about. When I was 5, 6, or 7 years old, I couldn't understand, why is this paper called Afro? Why are we only writing about black people? I don't understand, and I don't like it. Until Carl Murphy ran the picture of Emmett Till on the front. That changed my life. I just had to look at that for hours. I couldn't understand how any human being could do that to another human being. And then it dawned on me. Racism, hatred. And suddenly I realized why we had the afro.
A lot of powerful stories there. So thank you very much.
Thanks to Paul and Sarah and to all of you for joining us tonight. It's a fascinating story that is going to continue for quite some time, and we'll look forward to hearing the final results of your study later this year and perhaps into 2012. So thank you very much once again for joining us. Folks, if anybody's still hungry, there's still food in the kitchen, and you're welcome to join us. Thanks for joining us this evening. Have a good evening. The National Press Club with Marvin Kalb. Heather stayed on tonight when she arguably should have been on the road. She is leaving early tomorrow morning for Los Angeles, where she will receive the Alliance for Women in Media's 2011 award as Outstanding Producer in a Television News Series for her fabulous work on The Kalb Report. So congratulations, Heather. And now it is my pleasure to welcome back to Washington and to the National Press Club, Paul Steinle and Sara Brown.
Thanks, Mike. So if I was really a terrific manager at UPI, well, that's another story for another time, right? So anyway, thank you. So it's fun being here. I was just thinking about the speech that Jason Robards gave for Ben Bradley in All the President's Men. All that's at stake here is the Constitution and the First Amendment, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess a lot is at stake. So we've had a lot of fun doing this project, and I want to take a moment and tell you about what the rationale was for it and where did we get this idea. Probably a little bit of it is my time at UPI, where as a broadcaster, it was a new experience to go around and visit a lot of newspapers. And I got to see how newspapers work, what the ownership was like, what the value systems were. And I was very impressed by that. And it's something that stuck in the back of my mind. I started teaching in 1991, and everybody told me that newspapers were about to die in 1991. And of course, you know, almost, well, 20 years later, they're still here. So there seems to be a flaw in the reporting of the story somewhere. And we were doing an annual First Amendment forum at Southern Oregon University. And 2 years ago, in 2009, we were looking for a topic, and I thought, well, it'd be interesting to do a topic about whether the public really understands where most of the news in the United States comes from. I mean, they go to that internet and it's all there, but where did it really come from? And as we know, the Project for Excellence in Journalism did an analysis a year or 2 or 3 ago in Baltimore, and I think it was like 60 or 70% of the news came from the newspapers. That actually seems like a low number to me, but that's what they found, so I will trust it. So we decided to do this forum, and we had to come up with a name, so I came up with a smart aleck name, Who Needs Newspapers? And the idea being a facetious one, that we don't need those at all. But of course we do, because we know that's where a lot of the information comes from. So we did that, and it was fun. We had Bob Giles come out from the Neiman Foundation and talk to our people. And we had a good turnout for it. And then I was about to retire last year, and we were looking for a project. And we sort of started talking about this, Sarah and I, and sort of thinking, well, wouldn't it be fun to go around and do this? And wouldn't it be fun to have a mission? And wouldn't it be fun, the mission to be to report on the status of newspapers? And the premise is simply that how much fresh reporting have we seen from the newspapers of the United States? We know the Chicago Tribune's having problems. We know McClatchy's having problems. We've read about Lee, they're having problems. But what about the other 1,398 or 97 newspapers? So let's look into this a little bit. So we went out and decided to go out in the field and do this. To give it some framework, we created a 501c3, and we gave it the fancy name Valid.
Which is going to begin as soon as Mark enters the room. After his obituary was mistakenly published in a newspaper, Mark Twain, an old Associated Press man, famously sent a cable from London stating, "Reports of my death are greatly exaggerated." In this year of 2011, some have now written the obituary of newspapers. Are there publishers and editors out there today to contest the reports of their demise? Paul Steinle and Dr. Sara Brown are on a mission to find out. Since June of 2010, these two longtime media professionals have engaged in their own shoe leather reporting by visiting newspapers across the country to take the pulse of a cross-section of dailies, weeklies, and ethnic and alternative publications. So far, they've visited 44 newspapers in 44 states. In the process, they've created a national multimedia snapshot of the status of the industry on their website, whoneedsnewspapers.org. This evening, Paul Steinle and Sara Brown will present their findings to date, as well as the trends that are beginning to emerge. Journalist and educator Paul Steinle is the former president of United Press International. He was my boss there, and a terrific one at that. He's also been a war correspondent in Vietnam for Group W Radio, a television news director at KING in Seattle, and he ran the Financial News Network. Since 1991, he has been teaching journalism at the University of Miami, Quinnipiac University in Connecticut, and Southern Oregon University, where he rose to the position of Associate Provost. Dr. Sara Brown has been involved in the newspaper business for over 30 years as a human resource professional, management trainer, columnist, and educator. She helped manage newspapers including the Los Angeles Times and has conducted leadership workshops for the American Newspaper Publishers Association, now the NAA. She was also part of that valiant effort to save United Press International. For those who wonder what their spouses think of Paul and Sara heading all over America together, you should know that they have been married to each other for over 25 years. At George Washington University, our Global Media Institute, as many of you know, explores the evolving roles and responsibilities of the media in our society, as well as the transformation of journalism in the 21st century. We could think of no better program to bring to everyone's attention than Who Needs Newspapers. And we're very pleased to once again partner with Julie Hsu and the Eric Friedheim National Journalism Library here at the National Press Club on this event. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize a couple of my colleagues in the audience. First, Barbara Porter, who is now the Chief of Staff to the President of George Washington University, Dr. Stephen Knapp. Barbara and I actually worked together at United Press International for Paul Steinle, and Barbara actually worked with Paul out in Oregon as well. And also I'd like to recognize my colleague in the GW Global Media Institute, Heather Date, who so ably produces our Calb Report series here at.
If I could have your attention just for a moment, or maybe a little bit longer than that, and those of you who are in line, we don't discourage you from continuing to serve yourself. First of all, good evening and welcome. I'm Mark Hamrick. I'm the 104th President of the National Press Club, just here to issue a few welcoming remarks. Tonight's program promises to be illuminating and at the very heart of what it is that we do here at the National Press Club, and that is engage in discussions about our industry. We advocate for a free press, and we certainly are engaged in training. That's the key mission of the Eric Friedheim National Journalism Library, and our amazing director, Julie Hsu, is over there coordinating that part of the work, and if you have any questions of her, please don't hesitate to ask. I just first of all just like to remind you that that is the mission of the library, and that is an organization that serves the public. It is also one that takes donations, and we have our 5K run, which helps to raise funds for the library coming up on June 11th, and that certainly is open to the public, and we urge your participation there. One of the great things that we enjoy here at the National Press Club is the ability to partner with other organizations, and we have the best of relationships with George Washington University, embodied in the fine personality of my friend Mike Friedman, who will take the microphone in just a moment. He's the executive director of the Global Media Institute there and a professor of journalism. Won't you please give him a warm round of applause? Thank you.
Thank you, Mark Hamrick, and thanks for taking time out to welcome everyone. There is a board meeting of the National Press Club